Welcome to our APAC Ambassador Conversation series here on BizTech. I'm Jason Dacey, and I'm delighted to say that my special guest today is Her Excellency, Cara Owen. She is the UK High Commissioner to Singapore. Welcome to the show, Cara.
Thanks very much for having me, Jason.
Tell me about your diplomatic journey to Singapore. How did you get there?
I've actually got a bit of a love for this part of the world, starting with when my parents lived in the Philippines in the early 90s, and that was my first exposure to any non-European country. And then I've had postings in Hong Kong and Hanoi. I then had a posting in Paris, but nothing, it's like I'm on a bit of elastic. Nothing can keep me away from this region because I think it's one of the most dynamic and exciting regions in the world. And so I've come back here in a dream country job as High Commissioner in Singapore.
Oh, how wonderful. I mean, I lived in Singapore for many years, also Malaysia and the UK, so I can totally relate to why you like that part of the world so much. Can you tell us what the current state of diplomatic relations is between the UK and Singapore?
Well, really good. We're really long-standing partners. As you know, we have a sort of entwined history, but what's really exciting and what gets me up in the morning is the fact that it's a really future-focused relationship. It's deeply trusted relationship. So there are some things that we can do with the government of Singapore that might be more difficult with some other partners. And it's focused on the kind of issues that are going to secure our prosperity and security in the future, both countries.
And what about recent changes in the UK with foreign policy? How does that affect the dynamic relationship with Singapore?
Well, the UK government sees really clearly the opportunities that we have in this region to build on the brilliant partnerships that we've already got, but to deepen them even further. You will see that there have been a bunch of changes in terms of our representation in this region and in terms of some of our partnerships. So, for example, in December 2019, for the first time ever, we opened a specific embassy that is pointing towards ASEAN as an organisation. It being covered by our ambassador to Jakarta until then. But that has allowed us to transition into our own dialogue partner status with ASEAN. Sounds a bit boring, dialogue partner with ASEAN. Nobody knows, apart from a diplomat, what it is. But what it really is, it's totemic of the kind of deeper partnership and commitment we're making to this region. And it gives us a framework in which to make sure that we are constantly evolving the partnership in a way that makes sense for both parties.
And how do you see ASEAN at the moment, and you say the specific role that the UK has, given how the allegiances have changed across the region?
Well, look, we've got a really broad partnership with ASEAN. We are talking to them about really exciting future issues like how do you get the most out of digital economy, for example? What does digital connectivity look like? What can we do together in the future of trade? How can we partner with this region on decarbonisation? You know, that's something we're thinking about domestically. We've got really ambitious plans in that area. But this part of the world also has already made big commitments in how it's going to decarbonise its economies. And we think we can partner with them, not only with financing, but also with the kind of tech that we're developing and green finance in the UK.
Yeah, talk more about the tech side of things, you know, with the digitalization of Asia, particularly in Singapore. How do you see that?
Well, it's a fantastic place to be working in the tech sector. The UK tech sector is really, really strong. We've created 80 tech unicorns over the years in the UK, and Singapore is a really stimulating place to be doing tech. It's an easy-ish place for companies to land if they want to export here. And lots of our companies come to Singapore, not only for what Singapore represents and how open the economy is here, but also many of our 5,000 UK companies who have regional headquarters in Singapore are doing so because they're interested in springboarding into the broader Southeast Asia region.
And how's the UK's perspective on Singapore and ASEAN changed given what's happened, with Brexit and everything else and your relationship with Europe and the UK?
So I think our perspective towards this part of the world predated Brexit in a sense. But what's interesting is, I think, the whole conversations that we've had around what kind of country we want to be and where we think the opportunities are for UK companies. Of course, there's massive opportunities for UK companies in Europe, but I think really thinking internationally and thinking about the kind of possibilities, us forging new free trade agreements as we have done. We've got one with Singapore, we've got one with Vietnam, we've also got brand new ones with Australia and New Zealand, and all of that kind of discussion around the benefits of our independent trade policy are helping UK companies think even more broadly beyond our own geography to how we can operate in this part of the world.
I'm glad that you mentioned Australia and that free trade agreement between the UK and Australia, which is big news where I'm speaking from here in Australia. But, the way that the UK is looking to set up these free trade agreements is very exciting.
Yes, yeah, I think so. And you can see that sense of optimism. So we've got a really fantastic British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. And when you say to them, how is the community looking at it? We've been through some tough times through COVID, supply chains have been disrupted, but in one of their recent surveys, 84% of companies that they were polling, UK companies who are based in Singapore, were really optimistic about their plans for expansion and for hiring even more to help them expand in this region.
What about the defence side of things? Of course, the UK has that long history with Singapore. What's the defence agreement in place at the moment between Singapore and the UK?
Yeah, well, I guess there are sort of two building blocks for what we do together. Number one is a defence arrangement that is as old as I am. It was signed in 1971, involving Australia, New Zealand and ourselves, but also Malaysia and Singapore. And it's a really sort of unique arrangement that commits us to a very modern and relevant defence relationship between those five nations. We exercise together, we talk about how militaries are developing and how we can keep that arrangement relevant. But we've also got a really good and forward-looking modern defence relationship with Singapore, where not only are we doing things like exercises, we were really excited to have HMS Queen Elizabeth, one of our aircraft carriers, come through this region last year. And they made a stop here in Singapore, which was fantastic. But it also allowed other vessels within the carrier group to go off and exercise with 8 out of 10 of the ASEAN nations. And that is a really sort of precious defence opportunity we have had there. But in our relationship with Singapore, we talk about all kinds of issues. We talk about the role that tech is going to play. We talk about how do you decarbonise the military. We talk about CT. We talk about things like the roles communications play within the defence realm. So it feels like exciting, forward-looking, really close and comfortable, precious relationship.
Well, of course, we do have a very distressing war going on in Ukraine with Russia's invasion, which began in February. How much do you think that changes the geopolitical atmosphere across ASEAN, specifically in Singapore?
Well, look, I think so many countries are looking at what happened in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, which was utterly unprovoked and uncalled for. And so many of them have looked at it with deep distress. We have taken a range of actions. We always said in our integrated review, we said that the Euro-Atlantic region is going to continue to be the region that is at the heart of how we think about our defence. So for us, this is clearly, it's happening in our continent, it's happening in our neighbourhood. And the UK government has been taking its responsibilities very seriously in terms of supporting Ukraine, but also in making sure that it's just not okay. It's really clear that it's just not okay to invade a country in the way that Russia has invaded Ukraine. And so we have been looking at everything we can do to both support Ukraine, but also to make sure that there are costs for taking that kind of action. Because as our Prime Minister has said, Putin must fail in this endeavour.
Yeah, and looking at Singapore too, Singapore's stance is a bit different to the rest of ASEAN when it comes to its attitude towards Russia. What's your view on that?
Singapore has looked at the situation and made a decision that it's imposed sanctions against some Russian entities. It was very clear in what it said, why it said it had done that, including how it sees the invasion of Ukraine in terms of international law. And I think the Singapore Prime Minister and the Singapore Foreign Minister have explained in real detail why they took that step.
Right, let's talk more about the trade relationship between the UK and Singapore. Can you tell me the main exports and imports between the two countries?
So financial services and the services sector in general is really lively in both of our countries, really innovative sectors, and that is a big part of what we do together, but it's not the totality. You can see British companies represented right across the sectors. So, for example, we've got a really big Rolls-Royce presence, manufacturing and maintenance presence here in Singapore. We've also got our pharmaceutical companies like GSK and AstraZeneca that are represented here. We've got really strong legal firms. Increasingly, I think we're going to see some of our really exciting, what I think of as climate tech companies, contributing to the decarbonisation transition, both here in Singapore, but also more broadly right across the region.
And you mentioned AstraZeneca, and of course you did also touch on the pandemic and what we've been through over the last couple of years. What kind of role has AstraZeneca played in Singapore, if any?
So AstraZeneca has got a really important presence here, and I think AstraZeneca has a brilliant conversation with Singapore government, with other bits of the Singapore art ecosystem here. It's a really important, life sciences and pharma is going to be a really important part of the sector here, so I'm really pleased they're here. I think Singapore government, the AstraZeneca vaccine has been an important way that many countries have been able to protect their populations, help see them through the challenges of COVID and come out the other side and look forward to recovery, and I'm really proud of that.
And what about the opportunities going forward? You've touched on the digital side and also the environment. What other opportunities do you see on the trade side for British companies?
So I think the UK-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement is genuinely exciting and groundbreaking. It's the first time that the UK has negotiated a standalone digital economy agreement, and it's the first time that Singapore has had any agreement like that with any European country. And I think that puts us ahead as a kind of digital highway to enable. It's not just about tech this as well. I think that's one of the really important things. Some people think that a digital economy agreement is just for tech companies, but it's not. It looks at how you can harness digital tools to take out the friction of all kinds of trade. So instead of ending up with a stack of documents to export your goods that is about this high, burns many trees and takes ages to get processed, this kind of digital economy agreement is going to allow us to take all of that old style 400-year-old documentation out of it and move to things like e-signatures, e-customs. And the other thing that's really exciting is there's no point in having something like that unless it's really rooted in solving the problems that businesses want you to solve. So we have a great sort of coalition of supporting companies, fintech companies, for example, other types of exporters, traders, who keep us right and help make us see what are the future problems that we need to crunch through to make sure that as many UK companies can establish here for export and Singapore companies going in the other direction.
What about the UK population in Singapore? I remember when I moved to Singapore from the US about 20 years ago, there were a lot of Brits at that time, but I've heard that some expats, you know, with the pandemic and everything else have moved on. What's the population of British expats like in the UK compared to years past, in Singapore compared to years past?
Yeah, so we're still one of the biggest communities, and you can find Brits popping up all over the place. In media, we've got some of our top scientists are working inside Singapore universities. So we've got the last figures that you saw around 40,000. They don't get published very often. So I think we're still a really big community. I think some people, lots of people who've been here for a little while, went through COVID, looked at what am I going to do with the next phase of my life, and then might have made a decision to move. But I think there are lots of others that either remain here or will look to work here in the future. We've got over 5,000 UK companies that have a presence here, and that has grown remarkably in the last 2 years. During the pandemic, we've seen growth in that number. I think that just shows that the UK private sector absolutely has the opportunities in this part of the world right at the front of their mind, and they're seeing things like the Digital Economy Agreement, the Free Trade Agreement, our ambition to join CPTPP, of which Singapore is a founder member, and they can see the direction of travel, how important this part of the world is going to be to future economic growth, and they're really keen to come here.
And of course, the education side of things, there are international schools with a UK background there, and also, Singapore students, heading to the UK to study. What's the latest on that agreement and relationship on the education side of things?
So education in both directions actually is a really important part, not only of the sort of human fibres of the Singapore-UK partnership, but it's also a really important part of our future. I think if you are going to have working in this part of the world in your mind, then having some early experience, early formative experience, for example, studying for a period in Singapore, that would be great. So we really try and encourage that as much as possible, including using our own scholarship scheme, the Turing scholarships, to encourage students coming in this direction. But there's about 7,000 Singapore students that are studying in the UK in any given year. About 27,000 Singaporeans are studying in a kind of transnational way for UK qualifications, even while based here, so they still have exposure to the UK education experience. And here's a sort of micro stat, which is really amazing. Even though there are only 3.5 million Singaporeans, they are the third highest representative of international students from Asia at Cambridge University. And that shows how much they think of our own sector and how high quality the students coming out of Singapore are. They're a really precious part of our higher education ecosystem, I suppose. They bring an awful lot, and we're delighted to have them.
Wow, that's a really interesting stat. There is a bit of a struggle, I guess, between Australia, the UK, Canada, the US for international students. And here in Australia, we've seen borders being shut for, close to 2 years. I think UK has been a bit more lenient in that respect in terms of allowing international travellers back. Do you think that's factored into more Singaporeans going to the UK for, further education?
So we have been delighted to continue welcoming as many Singaporeans as want to come. We are very proud of our offering, and I don't mind saying that we feel that we want to make sure that we can beat the competition as much as we can, because you're right, it's a really competitive environment. They're high quality students. They're also incredibly discerning. So what Singaporean students, in my experience, most look for is an amazing education wherever they can find it, whatever their chosen focus is. And they also look for things like security and good value for money. So if we want to continue that flow, that which is the bedrock of some of the future partnerships, then I think all of us need to work really hard to make sure that our offering is brilliant.
Talk more about the cultural relationship between the UK and Singapore. I know from my time being in Singapore for so long, I did see strong links between Singapore and the UK, and strong links between Singapore and Australia. So how broad is it, do you think, on that little island?
Oh, I think it's really broad and really deep, and it covers absolutely every bit of our shared culture. The British Council, for example, has done really great work over many years, including around inclusion in the arts. So supporting artists and working with artists to make sure that their work gets not only visibility inside Singapore, but also internationally. And I'm really proud of that work. But there's a whole heap of stuff that goes on just organically. You're a sports broadcaster. of longstanding. And you don't need me to tell you how popular English Premier League is, for example. It's really hard for me to find somebody that doesn't have allegiance of one type or another to an English soccer team, and that is a great conversation starter. But also we see fantastic theatre coming out from the UK here. We see great pop music acts coming through Singapore, and I can't wait to see them coming back. And also increasingly, there was a really great showing by Singapore writers in the London literary festivals that were happening before COVID, and I can't wait to pick that up again.
Yeah, you touched on some very, very good points there. And of course, the writing, the authors that we've seen, coming out of the UK. And then definitely, I actually have a friend who's a British author in Singapore called Neil Humphreys, who's very well known across the region.
I'm a fan.
Yes. So we have that shared love of him. But yeah, when you talk about the sports side of things, with the Premier League being so big in Singapore and Malaysia, all across Southeast Asia, so how does that work, do you think, in terms of raising the profile of the UK and knowing what it has to offer for Singaporeans?
So I think football in the UK has a really special position. Not only is it what happens on the pitch, it's also what it means within the communities where the football teams are based. And as I have to say, I'm sorry, I can't avoid it, as a Liverpool fan, I am really proud of what the club means inside the city, but also more broadly for the community. You'll have seen maybe how Liverpool fans provided their own particular type of support for Cristiano Ronaldo, from one of our biggest rival teams, when he'd been through recent bereavement. And I think that really says something about our country, and it says something about football.
So what's to look forward to? What's on the horizon for you, and some special deals that may be happening between Singapore and the UK this year and beyond?
So in terms of sporting deals, I'm really hopeful that at some point we'll see some EPL teams back here in Singapore. Every time they come, there's a real buzz around town, and not only in those who go and see the matches, but also in the fact that the teams have great connections at a grassroots level, and they really like to engage at that level with kids, with local teams. So I'm really hopeful of seeing that. And of course, we were excited because the Formula One, which I think has a very special place. A lot of the motorsports industry has some of its most exciting R&D taking place within the UK, even for teams that don't sound necessarily British. They'll have massive R&D in the UK, where we've got a massive strength of adopting tech and digitalisation into keeping motorsport evolving and moving on. And that's coming to Singapore, and I think it will be coming back to Singapore. We've missed it. It'll be really hard to find somebody who's not excited about that too.
And how much do you think the relaxing of restrictions, both in the UK and in Singapore with COVID, hopefully we've got our fingers crossed that, things won't be too bad in terms of infections with COVID. How much will that help the relationship between Singapore and the UK, and of course, trade between the two nations?
Yeah, I think it'll help a huge amount. So I guess two things. Number one, I'm really impressed, as I said before, by how companies changed the way they tried to expand and think about coming into this region. So we saw this uptick in the number of UK companies that are in Singapore. But I can also tell I've been to a couple of major trade shows. I was at the air show, and the aerospace sector was almost giddy with excitement at being able to get back together, because I think they know that's how those kinds of international meetings and those connections that they have is how the really exciting innovation happen. Water Week. Who knew that Water Week that just happened last week here, which brought the whole water sanitation sector together from around the world, was going to be so exciting and so giddy, but it really, really was. And I know that lots of UK and Singapore investors and exporters are really excited about getting back on the road, about clapping eyes on some of the investments that they have wanted to make. But very often it's being present in the market that is the thing that you need to do to get a deal over the line. And I know about some really exciting pipelines that we've got in both directions. Singapore investors are very, very interested in the opportunities for investment in our energy sector and in sustainability plan within the UK. We're super ambitious around that in terms of hydrogen, new nuclear, wind power, carbon capture and storage, and we've got Singapore companies that are already invested in those sectors and that are interested in doing that, not only because they think it's a great thing to do, but also because they know that kind of involvement is going to enable them to bring some of the tech back into this part of the world where it could really have a fantastic home in decarbonisation over in Southeast Asia.
Well, it sounds like there's plenty going on. Let's hope that 2022 brings more prosperity for Singapore and for the UK. Thank you very much to Her Excellency Cara Owen. She is the UK High Commissioner in Singapore. Thanks very much, Cara. Hope to see you again soon, and all the best for your endeavours for the rest of this year.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Hope to see you again soon, Jason.
This has been our APAC Ambassador Series here on BizTech, the conversation series. If you want to get more, you can go to our website at www.biztech.asia. You can also find out more on our social channels. For now, I'm Jason Dacey saying goodbye, and we'll see you again soon.